This is Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. With the revelations of corruption of the Gun Trace Task Force, we talked to Dr. Lawrence Brown of Morgan State University about the future of policing. Despite new and troubling allegations of corruption from the recent trial of two members of the now notorious Gun Trace Task Force, the business of policing in Baltimore goes on. During the trial, witnesses, some of them former members who had pled guilty, alleged the department's command staff was well aware of overtime abuse and false reports. Those allegations only added to the already historic levels of malfeasance from a unit that dealt drugs, stole cash from residents, and overtime from the city. But even as doubts grow, recently appointed Police Commissioner Dill D'Souza announced a new command staff structure, an overhaul of an institution that is already under a federal consent decree for practicing unconstitutional policing. And like other developments, this move was not without controversy, including the transfer of Alicia White, one of the officers charged in the death of Freddie Gray, to Internal Affairs, which has been put on hold. As part of our ongoing in-depth series focused around the intractable problem of policing in Baltimore and beyond, we spoke to Lawrence Brown, Assistant Professor of Community Health at Morgan State University, who says the recent series of scandals reveals the underlying imperative of the real roots of American policing, and that it is time to look for different solutions. The Gun Trace Task Force, some people seem surprised, I don't think you were, but what is your impression, what was your impression of what has transpired since the trial began and the things that we've heard?
Well, I think the first thing is, it's just realizing that all of this being revealed now is on the heels of a DOJ investigation a couple of years ago, 164-page report that revealed a pattern and practice of racist policing, and not just the Baltimore Police Department, but even the school police department, and then how they worked hand in hand. And so, what's being revealed now is sort of on top of all of that. The systemic institution, it's like now we're seeing like the gross, the nitty gritty, ugly abuses and planting things on people and shooting and robbing people. I mean, it's grotesque. And it really is a reflection of the way that we have 80 to 90% of our police officers that don't live in Baltimore City, 10% of whom are commuting from places like Pennsylvania and Delaware. So they're coming from these basically green line, suburban, those same segregated white spaces that I talked about earlier. Now they're coming to police disinvested red line communities that they don't have a sense of or context for, other than perhaps what's sort of proliferated, the images that are proliferated in popular media. And so they're bringing in these racial biases. They're bringing in these stereotypes about entire areas in our city where they paint the people in those communities one way as hostiles. And then we have this language in the police department that says that they have a war room, and when they go to work, they're working a tour of duty. They're using technology like Stingray to capture cell phones for an entire area. So they're coming into a war zone. That's the mindset that these police are coming into these communities with, and it's reflected in their actions of the Gun Trace Task Force. They were coming in to win a war. And I think that's what happens when you have a hyper-segregated city. And you are concentrating lower income African Americans into one space where now they can be policed a certain way legally, according to Supreme Court case law like Illinois versus Wardlow, which is why Freddie Gray, when he was arrested, his arrest was legal because police can chase somebody differently, or they can chase someone in a high crime area legally in a way that they couldn't in a Roland Park, Guilford, or Homeland type of community. So this differential policing in a hyper-segregated environment, this is what we see with the Gun Trace Task Force is a outgrowth of what we allow in America legally. We allow lower income black communities to be policed a certain way. And so this was inevitable once you look at the context, this is what America produces. This is what our laws and the ways in which we set up our urban areas that it would produce. You see it in New York, stop and frisk. You see across America where police come in and they police black communities in a disproportionate with excessive force.
Well, that's really interesting because when you say war zone, you kind of conjure burnt out buildings and what you were talking about before about economic disinvestment. That's what you see when you drive in neighborhoods like the Western District of Area. It looks like doesn't it kind of look like a war zone because it's been burnt out, but also, as you said, the marrow's been sucked out of it. And this is one of the ways they do it with policing, right, to take the wealth out of the community. Does police play a role in that, taking sort of the wealth out of a community?
Well, I think it's sort of understanding, framing what happens with our structures and systems and policies and budgets in their proper way. Mm-hmm. What happens with redlining, subprime, predatory lending, that's structural violence. So the war that the police are coming into is at the tail end of what happens when banks redline, when our city government is basically investing in places like the White L, but not in the Black Butterfly. These structures create the bombed out look, the sort of disinvested environment in many of these lower income Black communities. And so I think, and the other thing is to realize historically, there's this language in the 1920s and the 19-teens you see in Baltimore, where in the Baltimore Sun at the time, that these articles really talk about the fear of the Negro invasion. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, a large part of segregation is built on this premise that if Black people move into our community, that they're going to damage our property values. Therefore, we have to create these laws, systems, policies, and practices that will exclude them. So that was a thinking, that was a mindset of war right there.
And so the police come in to kind of finish the deal, is what you're saying? Or?
I'm saying, right, that the hyper-policing comes at the tail end, or the hyper-policing we see now is coming on the aftermath. Because, you know, the criminal behavior, the antisocial behavior, that is festering in this type of construct. You know, crime and antisocial behavior are based on the environment in which people live in. People aren't committing this type of crimes, they're not engaged in violence in Roland Park. Why would they be? They have everything they need. But in Sandtown, people are struggling to survive. People don't have resources, don't have jobs. They're in a transit desert, a resource desert, a bank desert. So people don't have opportunities. So that's why people turn to crime. And so I think, you know, then hyper-policing comes in on the back of that. Instead of saying, wait a minute, it was the structural violence that was the original crime, that the structural violence is the crime. It's the primary crime that's being committed in those communities. And if you stop the structural violence, then you stop structural criminality, structural looting, you stop these things that are extracting wealth from Black communities. That allows people to thrive and sort of be able to live in a decent way. And so I think that is the way we have to think about it.
And the Gun Trace Task Force, from your perspective, was acting like they'd won the war, right? I mean, because they basically, that makes total sense, because they were the victors, and to the victors go the spoils, which is why they were kind of, from your, am I getting this right, that they were just kind of like, we can take whatever we want because we won this war against the African American community.
Right. Or I think that's largely right, but also the notion that, you know, that this is what we're doing is really, no one will care because this is what's been going on in these communities all this time. The structural crime being committed against Black communities disempowers people so much so that who's going to listen when the police come in and they conduct these type of, you know, egregious activities against Black communities. You know, people allowed the Stingray to be, you know, deployed against Black communities.
Just explain, the Stingray is a
the cell phone, you know, the device that allows police to snatch up cell phone signals for an entire area.
Right, without a warrant.
Right, without a warrant. And everybody, you know, criminal or not, their, you know, messages and phone signals are being intercepted. So, you look at the gun, not the Gun Trace Task Force, you look at the Baltimore Community Foundation, which founded, you know, or funded, or you know, accepted funded for the secret aerial surveillance, right? So I mean, again,
laughing, but it's crazy.
Yeah, this whole thing was laid out in sort of a way that,
without any knowledge of the city council or any approval from the public.
Absolutely,
one big warrantless surveillance.
War.
Yeah.
The Baltimore Police Department has been at war with the residents of Baltimore City in redline Black communities.
So we had talked about before we've done this series, why policing can't be reformed. You kind of agree with the concept. You know, talk a little about why you think that and what you think should be done in that sense.
Well, you know, the other thing is, like, look at the history of policing. Mm-hmm. You know, policing in America really starts on a foundation of catching enslaved people who are running away. the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that allowed police to deputize citizens to catch fugitive slaves.
And sometimes they did it for free.
Right, and to put them back in bondage. Like, this was a constitutional or a congressional measure that really put the nation on a trajectory for civil war, because the northern states felt strongly in the abolitionist communities that they shouldn't have to help return human beings back to their masters. And that people shouldn't be considered as property anyway. So that's where policing starts in America. So I think what we see now, in the way that, again, it's been strengthened through these Supreme Court case laws, you know, Illinois versus Wardlow, Terry versus Ohio, which authorizes the Terry stops. You know, these cases which allow legally police to police black communities in a different way. I think, you know, policing can't be reformed because it's designed to do the type of egregious, differential, discriminatory policing that we see. And that's why it can't be reformed. It has to be dismantled. It has to be restructured and reconstituted, in my mind, into a peace-building framework, combining what we think of in terms of crime control with health at the center, with public health, with mental health, and thinking about what is it that's actually inducing people to commit crime in the first place, and resolving whether it's issues of trauma, especially issues of lead poisoning, which is why you see, you know, lead poison is one that it's a neurotoxin that increases people's violent behavior. It causes them to not be able to focus well, so they don't perform well in school. Yep. Right, and so lack of control of their emotions. So, you know, in Baltimore, we are in a lead poisoning crisis in this city. The same way Flint declared a state of emergency, we should be declaring a state of emergency. And so it's these type of, you know, factors that are helping drive crime, and we're not dealing with the root causes of that. We're not addressing those factors, you know, extreme poverty. We're not addressing those type of factors that are actually pushing people to commit criminal activity. And I think that's why we have to put health at the center of crime control. We have to put helping people deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. We have to help them find a way to get lead out of the blood of children and young adults that have already been lead poisoned. Like, these are the type of things that are actually pushing people in the wrong direction. And it's in the brain, the neurotoxin, or is the negative effect of stress, prolonged toxic stress on the brain. And so that impairs decision making. So I think that's the way we have to sort of think when we go into communities to deal with crime.
You talked about the violence of economic disinvestment. Do you think that kind of stress can also precipitate violence and have a lot to do with the violence in the city?
I think any type of toxic stress pushes people to the edge. You see Grandmaster Flash, don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. And that's what's driving people, you know, being under extreme duress for long periods of time. That chronic stress is a killer.
With little hope.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think, you know, people, you take many people that live in Roland Park and you take away their resources. You take away their advantages, their opportunity, their access. Watch what type of behavior they begin to engage in. It's a matter of what type of environment people are placed in, the stress that they're put under, the toxins they're exposed to, that then alters brain chemistry and different type of behaviors emerge. So this is not, that's why it's not an indictment on people living in the Black Butterfly. It's an indictment on the structural crime, the structural violence that's been inflicted on these communities that then allow the type of tragedies and violence that we see on the street to really emerge.
Now, even though almost everything I've heard you say has been proven right in some way or form, are people, I mean, my last question would be, given the severity of the crimes of the Gun Trace Task Force, is there any possibility your ideas can come that some politically will be embraced? I mean, you know, even with how bad we see it, will people wake up and say, oh yeah, he's right about this? Or, you know, not that you just want to win a war there, but, you know, do you think that's possible?
It's improbable, I think, in many ways, under the current political construct. The Republicans surely won't do it. The Baltimore Democrats won't do it. The Baltimore Democrats have helped create Baltimore apartheid. It was Democratic mayors that created it, and it's Democratic mayors that maintain it. And they're invested in this system because they've been in power for so long. It's almost like a monopoly power. And so I think it's going to take really sort of a third or fourth or external party push or mobilization that will put power back in the hands of the people, that sort of mobilizing across systems that I talked about earlier. Cross-sectoral mobilizing, people organizing to really change the way fundamentally this city operates. That's the only way, because right now there's too much corporate control, there's too much investment in maintaining the status quo. And I think people are going to have to understand that even though their allegiance may lie with the Democratic Party, that in local areas, oftentimes the Democratic Party does not have the best interests of black communities in mind.
This is Stephen Janis and Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore.